When I first found my little house on Maplewood Drive, it felt like the universe had finally given me a break. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, cozy place with peeling white paint and floors that groaned when you walked across them. But it was perfect for me. The backyard was wild and untamed, full of weeds and overgrown bushes, but I loved the idea of taming it bit by bit, turning it into something beautiful. And the front porch. It was just big enough for 2 chairs where I could sit in the mornings with a cup of coffee and watch the world wake up. I moved here because I wanted peace. After years of living in a noisy apartment downtown, surrounded by honking cars and endless crowds, I craved quiet. Maplewood Drive seemed like the answer to all my prayers. The street was calm, the neighbors seemed friendly, and the air smelled fresh, like grass and earth. For the first time in forever, I felt like I could breathe. But what I didn't know then was that trouble was waiting just around the corner. Literally. One Saturday afternoon, as I was unpacking boxes in the living room, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing there, dressed in neatly pressed khakis and a polo shirt with Willow Creek HOA stitched onto the chest. He smiled warmly and introduced himself as Greg, an officer for the Homeowners Association. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, handing me a thick stack of papers. "Just wanted to make sure you are familiar with our guidelines." I took the papers, flipping through them quickly. My stomach sank as I realized what he was saying. "Wait, I'm not part of your HOA," I said, shaking my head. "My house isn't in Willow Creek. It's outside the development boundary." Greg's smile didn't waver, but his tone changed slightly. "Oh, don't worry about that," he said, brushing off my comment. "We'll figure it out later." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just a mix-up, maybe some administrative error that would get sorted out soon enough. But looking back now, I realized those words, "We'll figure it out later," should have been a warning, a red flag. Something inside me should have screamed danger. But instead, I shrugged it off. I told myself everything would be fine. That evening, as I sat on the porch sipping tea and watching the sunset, I felt content. Safe, like I'd finally found my forever home. What I didn't know was that this place, the sanctuary I'd dreamed of, was about to become the center of a nightmare. Little did I know, the people who claimed to protect neighborhoods were capable of tearing lives apart. And soon, they'd set their sights on me. Even though I tried to push the thought away, something about Greg's visit lingered in the back of my mind. That confident smile, those dismissive words, they felt wrong. Like he knew something I didn't. But how could I have guessed what was coming? How could I have known that this was only the beginning? A week went by, and I thought the whole HOA thing was behind me. Greg's visit had been strange, sure, but nothing else happened. No more knocks on the door, no letters slipped under it, nothing. I started to relax again, convincing myself that maybe he'd realized his mistake. After all, my house wasn't in Willow Creek. It was just outside their boundaries. Surely, they'd leave me alone now. But then came Martha. It was late one evening, and I was curled up on the couch reading a book when there was a sharp knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman standing there, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, her lips pressed together so firmly they almost disappeared. She wore the same polo shirt as Greg, with Willow Creek HOA stitched across the chest. Her name tag read Martha, and she carried herself like someone who expected immediate obedience. "I'm here to inspect your property," she announced without so much as a hello. Her tone was flat, matter-of-fact, like she was stating the weather instead of barging into my life uninvited. I blinked at her, confused. "Inspect my property? Why? I'm not part of your HOA." She ignored me completely, stepping past me into the living room like she owned the place. I stood frozen for a moment, stunned by her audacity. Who did this woman think she was? This was my house, my space, and yet here she was, walking around like she had every right to be there. "What are you doing?" I demanded, following her as she moved from room to room. She didn't answer, just scribbled notes on a clipboard while muttering things under her breath. Unapproved color scheme. Excessive vegetation. Non-compliant furniture arrangement. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice rising. I stepped in front of her, blocking her path when she tried to head upstairs. "You can't just walk into my home and start inspecting it. I'm not even in your HOA." Martha finally looked at me, her eyes cold and hard. "If you refuse to cooperate, we'll take further action," she said, her tone dripping with warning. Further action? What does that even mean? I shot back, my heart pounding. "I don't belong to your association. You have no authority over me or my property." For a moment, I thought she might argue, but instead she gave me a thin-lipped smile that sent chills down my spine. "That remains to be seen," she said before turning on her heel and walking out the door. I stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the spot where she'd been. My hands were trembling, and my stomach felt like it was tied in knots. What had just happened? Who were these people? And why were they targeting me when I wasn't even part of their group? The next day, the letters started arriving. One after another, they piled up on my doorstep, each one more aggressive than the last. They accused me of violating rules I'd never agreed to follow, rules about paint colors, landscaping, even the type of curtains I had hanging in my windows. The tone of the letters shifted quickly from polite reminders to outright threats. If I didn't comply, they warned, there would be consequences. Consequences. For what? Living in my own home. Things got worse at night. Loud bangs echoed against my front door, startling me awake. When I opened it, no one was there, just a note taped to the wood. "Fix your violations, or face consequences." My mind raced. Was someone trying to scare me? Intimidate me into leaving? It felt like I was being pushed towards some invisible edge, and I had no idea how to fight back. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow outside the window felt like someone watching. Sleep became impossible, replaced by a constant hum of anxiety. And through it all, one thought kept circling in my mind. How could this be happening? I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't part of their HOA. So why wouldn't they leave me alone? The days that followed Martha's visit felt like living in a fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like the ground beneath me wasn't as solid as it should be. The letters kept coming, sometimes one a day, sometimes 2 or 3. Each envelope bore the same logo, Willow Creek HOA, and each letter grew more intense, more demanding. "You are in violation of Section 3.2 regarding exterior paint colors," one read. "Failure to repaint within 7 days will result in penalties." Another said, "Your overgrown vegetation is a hazard. Immediate removal is required." It was absurd. My house wasn't even part of their neighborhood, yet they were treating me like I'd signed some invisible contract. Every time I opened one of those letters, my stomach churned. Who were these people? Why wouldn't they stop? I tried calling the number listed on the letters, hoping to reason with someone. But every time I did, I got voicemail, or worse, a dismissive receptionist who told me my concerns would be forwarded to the appropriate department. No one ever called me back. It was like shouting into a void. Then there were the noises at night. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. A loud knock on the door would jolt me awake, but when I opened it, no one was there. Just a note taped to the wood. "Compliance is mandatory," or "Time is running out." I started sleeping with a baseball bat by my bed, though I knew deep down it wouldn't do much good against whoever, or whatever, was out there. Fear became my constant companion. Every shadow outside the window made me jump. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps creeping closer. I installed security cameras, hoping to catch whoever was harassing me, but the footage never showed anything useful. Whoever it was, they were careful. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at another stack of letters, I realized I needed help. This wasn't normal. People don't just barge into your life, demand you follow rules you never agreed to, and threaten you when you refuse. Something bigger was going on here, and I couldn't face it alone. I reached out to a friend of mine, Lisa, who worked as a paralegal. She listened patiently as I explained everything. The letters, the inspections, the banging on my door at night. When I finished, she didn't laugh or tell me I was overreacting. Instead, she frowned and said, "This sounds serious. You might want to talk to a lawyer." Her words hit me hard. A lawyer? Was it really that bad? I hated the idea of dragging this mess into court, but what choice did I have? These people weren't backing down, and I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering what they'd do next. Before I could call a lawyer, though, things escalated again. One afternoon, as I was watering the plants in my backyard, I noticed a group of neighbors gathered near the fence line between my property and Willow Creek. They were talking in hushed voices, glancing toward my house every so often. When they saw me, they quickly dispersed, avoiding eye contact. I walked over to the fence, calling out to them. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm despite the knot forming in my chest. No one answered. One man shook his head slightly, almost apologetically, before hurrying away. A woman gave me a sympathetic look but said nothing. It was clear they were scared of crossing whoever was behind all this. That night, I found another note taped to my front door. This one was different from the others. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten in jagged, hurried scrawl. "Leave while you still can." My hands trembled as I read it. Leave? Leave what? My own home. The place I'd worked so hard to buy and fix up. Anger bubbled up inside me, hot and fierce. How dare they try to push me out of my own life? But beneath the anger was fear, real, raw fear. Because for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about rules or fines. This was personal. Whoever was doing this didn't care about compliance or guidelines. They wanted me gone. And I had no idea how far they'd go to make that happen. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where everything feels eerily quiet, like the world is holding its breath. I had just finished brewing my coffee and was about to sit down with it when I heard the first sound, a loud, sharp bang that echoed through the house. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, coffee mug in hand, listening intently. Another bang followed, louder this time, shaking the walls. Then came the splintering crack of wood. I dropped the mug, spilling hot coffee everywhere, and ran toward the noise. By the time I reached the entryway, it was too late. The front door, my front door, was lying on the floor, torn from its hinges. Standing in the wreckage were Greg, Martha, and two other people I didn't recognize, all wearing those same polo shirts with Willow Creek HOA stitched across the chest. "You've been served notice," Greg declared, stepping inside as if he owned the place. His voice was calm, almost casual, but his eyes were cold and unyielding. "You're trespassing on Willow Creek property. You need to leave immediately." My mind reeled. Trespassing. This was my house. I'd signed papers, paid for it, moved in my belongings. How could they claim it wasn't mine? "What are you talking about?" I shouted, my voice trembling with disbelief. "This is my home. I have the deed." Greg held up a piece of paper, waving it in my face. "According to our records, this lot belongs to the HOA. Your purchase was invalid. You're occupying land that doesn't belong to you." "That's insane," I yelled, taking a step back. "How could this happen? Why are you doing this?" He leaned closer, his tone dropping to a menacing whisper. "Because we can." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't here to negotiate or reason. This wasn't about rules or compliance anymore. It was about power. Pure, unchecked power. And suddenly, I understood. This wasn't just about me. It was about control. If they could take my home, they could do it to anyone. Fear clawed at my chest, but beneath it burned something else. Anger, white hot, searing anger. "This is illegal," I snapped, clutching the edge of the wall to steady myself. "You can't just break into someone's house and kick them out. I'll call the police." Martha smirked, crossing her arms. "Go ahead," she said smugly, "but don't expect them to side with you. We have documentation proving this property belongs to us. You're the one breaking the law here." Her confidence unnerved me. Had they really forged documents? Faked records? Was it possible they'd manipulated the system so thoroughly that even the authorities would believe their lies? I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I felt trapped, cornered like an animal. These people weren't playing fair. They never had been. "Pack your things," Greg ordered, gesturing to the suitcase sitting by the stairs. Apparently, they'd already decided I wouldn't resist. "You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. After that, we'll remove anything left behind." Remove, as in throw away. The thought of losing everything. The furniture I'd saved up for, the pictures of family, the little knickknacks that made this place feel like home, made my stomach churn. But there was no reasoning with them. Their minds were made up. As they turned to leave, Greg paused in the doorway, glancing back at me with a look of triumph. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said. "Leave quietly, and maybe we'll let you keep what's yours." I stood there long after they were gone, staring at the shattered remains of my front door. The sunlight streaming through the gap felt mocking, intrusive. This couldn't be real. It had to be some twisted nightmare I'd wake up from eventually. But deep down, I knew better. This was happening. And if I didn't act fast, I'd lose everything. After Greg and his crew left, I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the wall, staring at the broken door. My mind raced, but it felt like quicksand. Every thought pulling me deeper into panic. How could this be happening? This was my house, my sanctuary, the place I'd dreamed of for years. And now, these people were trying to take it away from me, as if I were some trespasser. But sitting there wasn't going to solve anything. I knew I had to act. First, I called the police. When they arrived, I explained everything. The letters, the inspections, the threats, the broken door. One officer examined Greg's paperwork while another took notes. But their expressions told me all I needed to know. "This sounds like a civil matter," the older officer said finally. "You'll need to settle it in court." Court. The word made my stomach sink. Fighting a legal battle would cost money I didn't have. And what if they were right? What if somehow, impossibly, the HOA really did own my land? Fear whispered in my ear. What if you lose your home because you can't afford to fight back? I couldn't let that happen. Desperation pushed me forward. I reached out to Lisa again, the friend who worked as a paralegal. She listened quietly as I recounted the latest events, her face growing grimmer with each detail. "This isn't normal," she said finally. "They're using intimidation tactics to bully you into leaving. You need a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, someone who specializes in property disputes." She gave me the name of an attorney named Rachel Chen, known for taking on cases involving predatory practices by homeowner associations. I called her immediately. To my relief, she agreed to meet me the next day. When we sat down together, I spilled everything: the escalating harassment, the forged documents, the invasion of my home. Rachel studied Greg's paperwork carefully, her brow furrowing. "This is sloppy work," she said after a while. "It's possible they fabricated these records. If we dig deep enough, we might find proof that your purchase was legitimate and theirs is fraudulent." Her words gave me a sliver of hope, but she warned me that this wouldn't be easy. "We'll need evidence," she said firmly. "Anything you can gather: emails, letters, photos, security footage. Document everything. And don't engage with them directly unless absolutely necessary. Let me handle communications moving forward." With Rachel's guidance, I began gathering every scrap of information I could find. I combed through old emails from my real estate agent, dug out copies of my mortgage agreement, and reviewed bank statements showing payments for the property. I also went online, searching for information about Willow Creek HOA. That's when I stumbled across something shocking. A string of complaints from former residents claiming the HOA had used similar tactics to seize their properties. Some had lost their homes entirely. Armed with this new information, I started reaching out to those neighbors, asking if they'd be willing to share their stories. At first, most were hesitant, afraid of retaliation. But one woman, Karen, agreed to speak with me. Over coffee, she recounted how the HOA had pressured her into selling her home under false pretenses. "They'll stop at nothing," she warned. "But you're doing the right thing by fighting back." Karen put me in touch with others who'd faced the same ordeal. Together, we pieced together a pattern of behavior, a scheme designed to intimidate homeowners into submission or force them out entirely. It was horrifying, but it also strengthened my resolve. These people weren't untouchable. They'd made mistakes, and I intended to expose every single one of them. As I worked alongside Rachel and the other victims, I felt a flicker of control returning. For weeks, I'd been powerless, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. But now, I had allies. Now, I had a plan. And for the first time since this mess began, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could win this fight. The day of the press conference was both terrifying and exhilarating. I stood outside my battered home, the broken door now patched up with plywood, clutching a stack of documents that proved everything. The forged records, the pattern of harassment, the stories from other victims. Reporters gathered around me, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in my face. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself think, but I knew this was my chance to fight back, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd been silenced by fear. I'm here today because I've been targeted by an organization that believes it's above the law. I began, my voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. The Willow Creek HOA has used intimidation, lies, and illegal tactics to try to take my home away from me. A home I legally purchased and paid for, but I'm not the only victim. I held up the documents, showing the reporters' pages filled with evidence, emails threatening legal action, letters demanding compliance with rules I never agreed to, even photos of the shattered door they'd broken down. This isn't about enforcing guidelines or protecting property values, I continued. It's about control. About forcing people out of their homes so the HOA can profit. They've done this to others before, and no one has stopped them. Until now. As I spoke, I noticed some of the neighbors standing at a distance, watching silently. Their expressions were mixed. Some looked scared, others curious. But none of them stepped forward to support me. Not yet, anyway. Still, I felt a surge of courage knowing I wasn't entirely alone anymore. Karen and a few other former victims had joined me, standing behind me as I told my story. Their presence gave me strength. The media coverage exploded almost instantly. Local news stations ran segments on my case, highlighting the predatory practices of the HOA. Social media lit up with hashtags like #JusticeForMaplewood and #StopHOABullying. People shared their own horror stories, flooding comment sections with accounts of similar abuse. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. The backlash against the HOA was swift and severe. Within days, local officials launched an investigation into their activities. Lawyers representing affected homeowners filed class action lawsuits, accusing the HOA of fraud, harassment, and extortion. The pressure mounted quickly, and cracks began to form within the organization itself. Greg and Martha disappeared overnight, along with several other key members of the HOA. Rumors swirled that they'd fled town to avoid scrutiny, leaving the remaining board members scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Without leadership, the HOA crumbled into chaos. Meetings were canceled, projects halted, and enforcement actions ceased altogether. But the real victory came when investigators uncovered proof of widespread corruption. Bank statements showed funds being funneled into personal accounts. Fake deeds and altered property records confirmed what I'd suspected all along. The HOA had been systematically stealing land and homes under false pretenses. One by one, victims started receiving apologies and restitution. For me, the moment of vindication came when a judge ruled in my favor, affirming that my purchase of the house was valid and ordering the HOA to pay damages for trespassing and vandalism. As I sat in the courtroom listening to the verdict, tears streamed down my face. I hadn't just won my home back. I'd taken down a system built on greed and fear. Still, the scars remained. Every time I looked at the patched-up door or heard a knock late at night, I couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. Trust didn't come easily anymore, and neither did peace of mind. But I reminded myself that I'd fought back, and I'd won. Months passed, and life on Maplewood Drive slowly began to feel normal again, or as close to normal as it could be after everything that had happened. The patched-up door was eventually replaced with a sturdy new one, though I kept the old piece of plywood in the garage as a reminder of what I'd been through. It wasn't just about remembering the fear. It was about remembering how far I'd come, how I'd stood my ground when it would have been easier to give up. The neighborhood itself changed too. Without Greg, Martha, or their oppressive regime, the Willow Creek HOA dissolved completely. Some residents tried to revive it under new leadership, but this time, they approached things differently, more transparently, more fairly. They reached out to me and other outsiders like me, inviting us to community meetings not as enemies but as neighbors. It was strange at first, sitting in those meetings and hearing people talk about guidelines and shared spaces without feeling the weight of judgment or hostility. But over time it felt okay, even good. Karen became a regular part of my life during those months. After coming forward to share her story, she decided to stay involved, helping others who'd been affected by similar schemes. Together, we formed a grassroots group aimed at educating homeowners about their rights and advocating for fair practices. We held workshops, handed out flyers, and even started a website where people could report suspicious activity by HOAs. It gave me a sense of purpose, a way to turn something awful into something meaningful. Still, there were moments when the past crept back in. Late at night, when the house was quiet and shadows stretched across the walls, I find myself thinking about that day. The sound of splintering wood, Greg's cold smile, the suffocating feeling of being powerless. Those memories didn't fade entirely, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. And maybe that was okay. Maybe remembering was important, not because it brought pain, but because it reminded me of my strength, of how much I was capable of enduring and overcoming. One evening, as summer settled into autumn, I sat on my porch watching the golden light of sunset spill across the yard. Fireflies blinked lazily in the cooling air, and somewhere down the street, someone played soft music. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly safe, truly at home. Lisa stopped by later that night with a bottle of wine to celebrate the end of what she called the saga. We sat on the porch steps, sipping from mismatched glasses and laughing about how surreal the whole thing had been. "You know," she said after a while, "most people wouldn't have fought back the way you did. You're braver than you think." I shook my head, smiling. "I don't know about brave. Stubborn, maybe. I just couldn't let them win." "Same thing," Lisa teased, nudging me with her elbow. Maybe she was right. Maybe standing your ground, even when everyone around you seems bigger, stronger, scarier, is its own kind of bravery. What I did wasn't perfect. There were days when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was making things worse instead of better. But in the end, I refused to let fear dictate my life, refused to let anyone take away something so precious to me without a fight. As the stars came out and crickets chirped in the distance, I realized something important. Home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's the place where you feel safe enough to be yourself, where you can sit quietly with your thoughts or laugh loudly with friends without worrying about who's watching or waiting to pounce. And sometimes, protecting that sense of belonging means finding strength you never knew you had. Now, whenever I walk through my front door, I pause for a moment to take it all in. The creaky floors, the wild garden I've worked so hard to tame, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. This is mine, not because of papers or deeds, but because I fought for it, because I chose to stay.